Before we get into what might be the most shocking thing that has ever happened on Family Feud, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. Turn on that notification bell because we post stories like this every single week and you are not going to want to miss any of them. Now let me tell you what happened. They say every man has secrets. Small ones. Harmless ones. The kind of secrets that do not really matter. But what one husband had been hiding from his wife, his children, and his entire community for over a decade was not small, and it was not harmless. It was a whole second life, a second home, a second family, a second version of himself that nobody knew existed, and it all came crashing down on the Family Feud stage in the summer of 2025, when a woman in the audience stood up and said 6 words that made Steve Harvey freeze in place. 6 words that turned a game show into a courtroom, a husband into a defendant, and a Tuesday afternoon into the most talked about moment in Family Feud history. Steve Harvey has hosted thousands of episodes. He has heard every kind of answer. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what happened that day. Purpose build deep emotional connection through detailed backstory and establish the scope of the deception. Kevin and Sharon Brooks had been married for 19 years. They lived in a well-kept colonial house in Richmond, Virginia, in a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody and Sunday mornings smelled like fresh, cut grass and somebody's barbecue warming up for the afternoon. Kevin was the kind of neighbor who would lend you his lawnmower without you having to ask. Sharon was the kind of woman who brought a casserole when someone in the neighborhood was sick, even if she barely knew them. Together, they were the couple that held the block together, the couple that hosted 4th of July, the couple that other couples wanted to be. Sharon was 45 years old. She taught 3rd grade at Westover Elementary School, the same school she herself had attended as a child. She had been teaching there for 18 years, and in that time she had touched the lives of hundreds of children. She was the kind of teacher who stayed after school to help kids who were struggling, who bought supplies out of her own pocket when the budget ran out, and who remembered every student's birthday. The school had named their annual Kindness Award after her, the Sharon Brooks Award for Compassion. She kept the little plaque on her desk at home and sometimes looked at it when she needed a reminder that her work mattered. Kevin was 48. He worked as a regional logistics coordinator for a national shipping company. The job required him to travel frequently, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks out of every month. He was responsible for overseeing distribution centers across the Southeast, which meant he spent a lot of time on the road between Richmond, Raleigh, Charleston, and Jacksonville. It was a demanding job, but it paid well, and Kevin had always told Sharon that the travel was the price they paid for the comfortable life they had built. Sharon accepted that. She trusted him. She had always trusted him. They had 2 children. 18-year-old Aiden was a senior in high school with plans to study engineering at Virginia Tech in the fall. 14-year-old Sophie was a freshman who ran cross-country and had her mother's kindness and her father's quiet confidence. Both kids were good students, good kids, the kind of children that made their parents look like they had it all figured out. Sharon's mother, 71-year-old Mabel Patterson, lived just 10 minutes away and was a constant presence in their lives. She picked the kids up from school when Sharon had meetings, made Sunday dinner every week, and doted on her grandchildren like they were the center of the universe. Mabel had lost her own husband 8 years ago and had channeled all of her love into her daughter's family. She called Kevin her second son and treated him with the same warmth and respect she gave her own flesh and blood. The Family Feud taping was supposed to be a fun family outing. Kevin had gotten the tickets through a colleague at work, and Sharon had thought it would be a great way to spend a Saturday. They were not contestants. They were audience members. They had front row seats. Sharon had packed snacks. Mabel had worn her good earrings. The kids were excited. It was supposed to be a perfect day, a simple, happy, uncomplicated day. But 500 miles away in Jacksonville, Florida, a 34-year-old woman named Tasha Williams had also gotten tickets to that exact same taping. And Tasha was not there for entertainment. She was there because she had discovered something that had turned her world upside down, and she was done being quiet about it. Here is what nobody in that audience knew. Kevin Brooks had been living a double life for 11 years. In Jacksonville, where he traveled regularly for work, he had a second home, a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet complex near the river. He had a second relationship with Tasha Williams, a woman he had met at a conference 11 years ago and had been seeing ever since. Tasha believed she was Kevin's girlfriend. She knew he traveled for work. She knew he was busy. But she did not know he was married. She did not know about Sharon, about Aiden, about Sophie, about Mabul, about the colonial house in Richmond, about any of it. For 11 years, Kevin had told Tasha that he was a single man with a demanding job, and she had believed him because she loved him and because she had no reason not to. 3 weeks before the Family Feud taping, Tasha had found a receipt in Kevin's jacket for a restaurant in Richmond. She looked at the restaurant online and saw a tagged photo on social media. In the photo was Kevin, sitting at a table with a woman and 2 teenagers, smiling the same smile he gave Tasha when he walked through her door every other week. The caption, posted by a woman named Sharon Brooks, read, "Family dinner with my favorite people. 19 years and counting." Tasha's world collapsed. 11 years of love. 11 years of waiting for him to come back from his business trips. 11 years of believing she was building a future with this man. All of it was a lie, and when Tasha discovered that Kevin's family had tickets to a Family Feud taping, she bought her own ticket. She flew to the studio, and she sat in that audience with one purpose: to look Kevin Brooks in the face and ask him to tell the truth for the first time in 11 years. Purpose: build emotional investment through escalating tension as 2 worlds collide on a game show stage. The taping begins. The taping that day featured the Delgado family from Texas against the Franklin family from Ohio. It was a high-energy game with lots of laughs. Steve Harvey was in top form, cracking jokes, doing his signature reactions, keeping the audience engaged. Sharon and her family were having a wonderful time. Aiden and Sophie were laughing. Mabel was clapping along with every answer. Kevin was relaxed, his arm around Sharon's shoulders, looking like a man without a care in the world. 6 rows behind them, Tasha Williams sat alone. She was wearing a simple black dress and clutching her purse in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She had spotted Kevin the moment she walked in. She had seen him sitting with a woman who was clearly his wife, with 2 teenagers who were clearly his children, with an elderly woman who was clearly his mother-in-law. And everything Kevin had ever told her about his life disintegrated in that moment. He was not single. He was not dedicated to his career above all else. He was a husband, a father, a family man, and he had been lying to her face for over a decade. Tasha sat through the first half of the taping in silence. She watched Kevin laugh. She watched him kiss Sharon on the forehead during a commercial break. She watched him lean down and say something to the elderly woman that made her smile. Every gesture was a knife. Every moment of his real life was proof that hers had been fiction. She had planned to stay quiet. She had planned to confront him privately afterward. But as the taping went on, and she watched this man perform the role of perfect husband and father with the same effortless charm he had used on her for 11 years, something inside her shifted. The anger that had been simmering for 3 weeks went from a simmer to a boil. The moment it happened during a break between tapings. Steve Harvey was doing his usual audience warm-up, walking through the crowd with a microphone, chatting with people, getting laughs. He stopped near Sharon and Kevin's row. "How long you 2 been married?" Steve asked, pointing at them. Sharon beamed. 19 years. Steve whistled. 19 years. That is beautiful. What is the secret? Kevin leaned into the microphone and said, "Trust Steve. She trusts me completely, and I give her every reason to." That was the moment Tasha stood up. She rose from her seat 6 rows back, and in a voice that cut through the noise of 200 people like a blade through paper, she said 6 words. "Is that what you told me?" The studio went quiet. Not gradually. Instantly, 200 people stopped talking, stopped laughing, stopped breathing. Steve Harvey froze. The microphone was still in his hand, but his arm had dropped to his side. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes moved from the woman who had spoken to Kevin, who had turned white. Then Steve's eyes went to Sharon, who was looking at Tasha with an expression of pure confusion. Then back to Kevin, whose face was no longer the face of a man without a care in the world. It was the face of a man whose entire carefully built existence was crumbling in real time. Steve Harvey later said in an interview that in all his years of television, he had never experienced a moment where his body and his brain both shut down at the same time. He said his feet would not move. His mouth would not form words. He just stood there, holding a microphone in a silent studio, watching a catastrophe unfold 6 feet in front of him. He said it was the only time in his career that he had absolutely no idea what to do next. The confrontation. Tasha stepped into the aisle. Her voice was shaking, but it was clear. "My name is Tasha Williams. I have been in a relationship with this man for 11 years. He told me he was single. He told me he had no family. I found out 3 weeks ago that everything he ever said to me was a lie." She was looking directly at Kevin. Kevin had not moved. He sat in his seat like a man bolted to it. His arm had fallen from Sharon's shoulder. His hands were gripping the armrests of his chair. He was not looking at Tasha. He was staring straight ahead at the stage, as if he could will himself to be somewhere else. Sharon turned to Kevin. Her face was a map of confusion turning to horror, turning to understanding. All the business trips, all the late night calls he stepped outside to take, all the times he said he had to stay an extra day in Jacksonville because of work, the pieces that had never quite fit were suddenly snapping into place with a sickening clarity. "Kevin," Sharon said. Just his name. One word. But the way she said it carried 19 years of love, 19 years of trust, and the weight of their entire life together. Kevin finally spoke. His voice was barely audible. "Sharon, please. Not here? Please not here." But Tasha was not finished. 11 years, Kevin. I gave you 11 years of my life. I turned down other relationships because I thought you were the one. I waited for you every time you said you had to leave for work. I celebrated holidays alone because you said you had to travel. And the whole time you were here. With them. Living the life you told me you did not have. Tasha's voice broke on the last sentence. The anger she had carried for 3 weeks was cracking open, and underneath it was something much heavier. Grief. She had not just lost a boyfriend, she had lost 11 years of her life to a fiction. 11 years of birthdays alone. 11 years of empty holidays. 11 years of waiting for a man who was never really hers. The audience could feel every ounce of that pain. Several women were already crying. Men were shaking their heads. The energy in that studio was unlike anything anyone had ever felt in a television setting. Aiden, the 18-year-old, was the first of the children to react. He stood up, looked at his father, and in a voice that was low and hard, said, "Dad, is this true?" Kevin could not look at his son. Sophie, the 14-year-old, had grabbed her grandmother's hand. Mabel was sitting very still, her face gray, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She had not said a word. But the look in her eyes was the look of a woman who had just watched someone hurt her family in the deepest way possible, and she was deciding how to respond. Purpose. Steve's powerful intervention, community rally, and justice delivered through truth. Steve finds his voice. Steve Harvey later described that he stood frozen for what felt like 5 minutes, though it was probably closer to 20 seconds. 20 seconds of pure silence in a studio that was built for noise. And then something clicked. He said it was not his producer's voice in his earpiece. It was not his training. It was something older and deeper than that. It was the part of him that remembered being a man who had failed, a man who had hurt people, a man who had to rebuild his own life from the wreckage of his own mistakes. And that part of him said, "You know what to do." Steve walked to the center of the audience area. He stood equidistant between Sharon and Tasha, with Kevin sitting between them like a man caught between two realities that had finally collided. Steve raised the microphone and spoke. His voice was calm but heavy, the way a voice gets when it is carrying something important. "I am going to say something right now, and I want everyone in this room to hear me. What is happening right now is not entertainment. This is not a bit. This is not a segment. This is two women finding out that the same man has been lying to both of them. And there is a word for that. The word is betrayal. And betrayal does not just hurt the person you lied to. It steals their time. It steals the years they could have spent with someone who was honest. And you do not get to take someone's years and call it love. The audience erupted, not in applause, in something heavier than applause, a sound that was part agreement, part anguish, part relief that someone with a microphone was finally saying what everyone was feeling. Steve turned to Kevin. "Kevin, I am not here to judge you. God will do that. But I am here to tell you that right now, in this moment, you owe these two women something you have not given either of them in over a decade. The truth, all of it, no more hiding. No more performing, just the truth." Kevin sat in his chair and said nothing for what felt like an eternity. The whole studio waited. And then, quietly, like a dam giving way to pressure it could no longer hold, he began to speak. It started as a mistake, one trip, one night, and then it became something I could not stop. I told myself I was not hurting anyone because nobody knew. I told myself that if I kept everything separate, if I kept the two worlds apart, then it was not really a lie. But it was. Every day of it was a lie, and I am the only one to blame. He turned to Sharon first. "You deserved better than me. You deserved better every single day for the past 11 years, and I am so sorry that I was too weak and too selfish to give you that." Then he turned to Tasha, and what he said to her was perhaps the most devastating part of all. "I lied to you from the very first day. You built your life around something that was not real, and that is on me. I am sorry." Mabel's words. Mabel Patterson, who had been sitting in silence through the entire ordeal, slowly rose to her feet. 71 years old, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She did not look at Kevin. She walked to where Tasha was standing in the aisle, and she did something that nobody in that studio expected. She took Tasha's hand. "Baby," Mabel said, her voice steady and warm and impossibly gentle. "You did not do anything wrong. You loved someone who did not tell you the truth. That is not your shame to carry. That is his. And I am sorry on behalf of my family that you lost 11 years of your life to a man who was not honest enough to let you make your own choices." Tasha broke. She had come to that studio full of anger and ready for a fight. But she had not been prepared for kindness. Not from the mother-in-law of the man who had deceived her. Not from the family she thought she was confronting. The anger dissolved, and what was left was just a woman who had been deeply, terribly hurt. She cried, and Mabel held her hand and let her. Steve Harvey, standing just a few feet away, later called it the most Christ-like thing he had ever seen in person. He said that Mabel Patterson, a woman who had every reason to be angry at Tasha for disrupting her family's day, instead chose to see her as what she was, another victim. And in that choice, Mabel showed a kind of grace that most people only talk about in church but never practice in real life. Sharon, who had been sitting in stunned silence, stood up. She did not look at Kevin. She walked to her children, put one arm around Sophie and one hand on Aiden's shoulder, and said, "We are leaving." It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was a mother gathering her children and walking away from something that could no longer be fixed with words. Aiden picked up Mabel's purse from her seat, walked to his grandmother, and gently guided her away from Tasha and toward the exit. The family left the studio together. Kevin stayed in his seat alone, in a room full of 200 strangers who now knew exactly who he was. Purpose: reinforce the moral lesson, show lasting impact, and deliver universal wisdom. The aftermath. The producers had a dilemma. What had happened was not part of a game. It was not a contestant moment. It had occurred during an audience warm-up, which meant the footage technically belonged to the show, but existed in an ethical gray area. Steve Harvey personally intervened and said that the footage should only be released with the consent of both Sharon and Tasha. He said he would not profit from someone else's pain without their permission. 2 months later, both women gave their consent. Sharon said she wanted the world to see what a double life looked like, so that other women would recognize the signs. Tasha said she wanted people to understand that the other woman is not always the villain. Sometimes she is a victim too. When the footage aired as a special segment on Steve Harvey's talk show, it broke viewership records. The clip was shared over 6 million times in the first week. It was covered by every major news outlet. Podcasts and talk shows spent days dissecting what had happened. But the conversation was not about scandal. It was about truth, about the cost of deception, about the women and children who pay the price when one man decides his comfort matters more than their reality. What happened to Sharon? Sharon filed for divorce within a month. She kept the house. She kept her dignity, and she kept teaching 3rd grade at Westover Elementary. Her students never knew what she was going through. She showed up every day with the same steady, warm presence she had always brought to that classroom. Her colleagues knew, of course. The whole country knew. But Sharon Brooks did not let her worst moment define her work. She let her best qualities carry her through it. 6 months after the incident, Sharon started a podcast called Still Standing. It was a simple format, just Sharon talking honestly about what it felt like to discover that the life you thought you were living was built on a lie. She talked about the anger, the grief, the embarrassing moment of realizing that you were the last to know something that defined your own existence. But she also talked about the other side, about learning to trust herself again, about finding out that she was stronger than the worst thing that had ever happened to her. The podcast gained over 500,000 listeners in its first year. What happened to Tasha? Tasha Williams went home to Jacksonville and rebuilt her life. She ended all contact with Kevin. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in relationship trauma, and she made a decision that changed everything for her. She reached out to Sharon, not to apologize because she had done nothing wrong, but to say, "I know we are both hurting, and I know we were both lied to, and I think there is something powerful in the fact that neither of us has to go through this alone." Sharon accepted the call. And what started as a cautious, awkward conversation between 2 women who had been deceived by the same man turned into something nobody expected. A friendship, not the kind built on shared joy, but the kind built on shared survival. They understood each other in a way that nobody else in their lives could. They talked regularly. They supported each other's healing. And a year after the incident, Tasha appeared as a guest on Sharon's podcast. The episode, titled The Other Side of the Lie, became the most downloaded episode of the year across all podcast platforms. In it, both women spoke openly about what Kevin's double life had cost each of them and what they had built in its wake. Mabel's legacy. Mabel Patterson's decision to take Tasha's hand in that studio became one of the most analyzed moments in the entire story. Relationship experts wrote about it. Pastors referenced it in sermons. A sociology professor at Howard University used it as the centerpiece of a lecture on empathy and moral leadership. Mabel herself was characteristically humble about the attention. When a reporter asked her why she had reached out to Tasha instead of being angry at her, Mabel's answer was simple. She said, "That girl was hurting." And when someone is hurting in front of you, you do not stop to figure out whose fault it is, you just help. That is how I was raised. That is how I raised my daughter. And that is how we are going to get through this. Steve Harvey's reflection. Steve Harvey addressed the incident on his talk show in a segment that lasted almost 15 minutes, far longer than his producers had planned. He was emotional and honest. He talked about freezing on that stage and what it taught him about the limits of charm and humor in the face of real human pain. He talked about Mabel and called her the real hero of the story. And then he said something that became the defining quote of the entire episode. "I have been on television for 30 years. I have made people laugh millions of times. But the moment that will stay with me forever is the moment when a 71-year-old grandmother took the hand of the woman her son-in-law had been lying to and said, 'That is not your shame to carry.' That moment taught me more about character than 30 years in this business. Because character is not what you do when everyone is watching. Character is what you do when your world is falling apart and you still choose to be kind." The story of Kevin Brooks's double life became a cautionary tale that was discussed in marriage counseling offices, universities, and living rooms across the country. But it also became something more. It became the story of 3 women, a wife, a girlfriend, and a grandmother, who responded to the worst kind of betrayal with the best kind of humanity. Sharon responded with strength, Tasha responded with courage, and Mabel responded with grace. Together, they showed the world that when a man's lies fall apart, it is the women who pick up the pieces. And sometimes, if those women are extraordinary enough, they pick up each other. 2 years after that day in the studio, Sharon and Tasha Coe hosted a live event in Richmond called The Truth Project, a day-long conference for women who had been impacted by infidelity and deception. Over 3,000 women attended. Mabel gave the opening remarks. She walked to the microphone, looked out at 3,000 faces, and said, "I am 73 years old. I have seen a lot of broken things in my life, but I have never seen anything so broken that love could not start to fix it. Not the romantic kind of love. The kind that says, I see you, and I am not going to let you fall." The ovation lasted 2 full minutes, and when it finally died down, Mabel smiled and said, "Now who wants to get to work?" If this story moved you, if Mabel's grace and these women's strength inspired you, then do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that the truth always wins in the end. We bring you stories like this every single week. Real moments of courage, family, and faith from the Family Feud world. And remember what Mabel taught us: when someone is hurting in front of you, you do not stop to figure out whose fault it is. You just help. See you in the next one.